I wonder what I should talk about this week on Comic Tropes. It's more fun to think about all the wacky adventures I've had at conventions in the past. Like these times with Robert Kirkman. Oh yeah, that one too. Wait a minute. Robert Kirkman? I know! I'll talk to you all about the finale of The Walking Dead and how I think it's an exceptional ending to an epic story. Join me, won't you? Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. It's often said that the most important aspect of reading a story is enjoying the journey. But I would argue that the ending is also critical. That's the difference between feeling a type of satisfaction, like you've invested your own time well in a project, versus just feeling like, you know what, that's fine, but I'm probably not going to revisit that story again. Well, I would argue that The Walking Dead nailed its ending. I think that Robert Kirkman gave us a satisfying ending to this long-running zombie apocalypse story, and he surprised us along the way. So today, I'm going to talk specifically about this comic, which, can you believe it, ended 5 years ago already. So without any further ado, let's talk about the ending of The Walking Dead. Writer Robert Kirkman pitched The Walking Dead to Image around November of 2002, and he explained his story by saying, quote, "The idea behind The Walking Dead is to stay with the character, in this case, Rick Grimes, for as long as humanly possible. I want The Walking Dead to be a chronicle of years of Rick's life. We will never wonder what happens to Rick next. We will see it. The Walking Dead will be the zombie movie that never ends. Well, not for a long time, at least." End quote. And after 16 years of telling that story, it surprised readers by ending. I will argue it ended at a place that made sense. And if your knowledge of The Walking Dead comes from the TV shows, that's fine, but it is radically different from the comics. Rick Grimes, the protagonist, was a small-town sheriff from Kentucky who, in Kirkman's pitch, had never had to shoot a gun in the line of duty. Through a combination of mercy,
mercy prevails over my wrath,
toughness, and common sense,
this world is yours by right. We are life. That's death. And it's coming for us. Unless we stand together. So go home. And then the work begins. The new world begins.
Rick leads other survivors to increasingly bigger safe zones against a world full of the undead, mindlessly driven to kill whatever is near them. Along the way, Rick and his group encounter leaders who are fascists like the Governor, bullies like Negan, or anarchists like the Whisperers. These story arcs and others culminate in skirmishes and wars, and while Rick emerges the victor, he always loses people close to him, from his wife to friends and allies like Glenn, Tyrese, Abraham, and even his partner Andrea. But the final battle in Walking Dead became a very different type of confrontation, where no one died. The final story arc in the Walking Dead comics is the Commonwealth arc, which takes place at the best defended city yet, run by a governor, Pamela Milton. That begins in issue 175, so it's a relatively long storyline until the final issue of the series, 193. The key players at this point include Rick, who keeps getting pushed into a leadership role. There's his son, Carl, who is a young man dealing with the loss of his surrogate mother, Andrea, as well as relationship stuff at this point. Pamela Milton is not a dictator, but there are cracks in her character as she fiercely enforces class roles and is doing everything she can to make sure her incompetent son Sebastian is being groomed to take over one day. Mercer is the head of security for the Commonwealth, admired by his men, and in turn, he admires Rick, but is sick of how Pamela treats the working class. There are a host of allies from Rick's past, but by now there are several cities and towns, and they each have roles re-establishing society, from governance with Maggie to technology with Eugene. If you're most familiar with the TV show, you may already notice some key differences. Rick and Carl are the main characters in the comic, but both actors had left the show shortly before it ended. So in some ways, that was actually to the TV show's advantage. It let them lean on an ensemble cast and develop projects like spin-offs with Daryl and Negan. In the TV show, Daryl is an original character. Carol is an important character on the show, but she got killed off fairly early on in the comics. There's other differences. Negan in the comics got exiled from the Commonwealth by issue 174, but he continues on the show until the end and even got his own spin-off. We're going to focus, though, on the comic book storyline today. The biggest difference in the comics from the show is that the final confrontation was not a big physical fight, but that was also different from previous storylines in the comics themselves. In the final issues, Pamela senses a potential coup attempt by Mercer and has him arrested. His team is very loyal and breaks him out of prison. Pamela raises a militia in response to take arms against this uprising. In issue 191, Rick ultimately stands between the two and diffuses a potential war in a battle of words. Rick gives a stirring speech that what they have built is precious and that together they can achieve a peaceful future. He denounces Pamela and says that he had supported her because he saw her potential, but she has let him down by raising arms against her own citizens. Importantly, Rick says, "We are not the Walking Dead," in a reversal of his famous line all the way back in issue 24. This works on a couple levels. Rick originally said the human survivors were the Walking Dead because it meant their time was limited in this world. He was in a dark place. Now he sees that they are the living. And on a metatextual level, it was an indication that the story was nearly over, because if they weren't the titular characters of the book, what was left? This was the first time a conflict had been solved without violence. It's a huge turning point for the main characters. Rick had finally helped them get to a place where they could all agree on the rule of law. Pamela consented to her arrest, having been willing to use an army against her citizens. And perhaps this is why Rick finally felt safe enough to make a mistake. He didn't lock his bedroom door at night, and Pamela's awful son, Sebastian, has a tantrum and shoots Rick in revenge that night. Robert Kirkman had always said in interviews that The Walking Dead would follow Rick Grimes as long as possible, and he did that. The big speech that Rick delivers is a turning point for all of the characters, and at that point, there's really nothing left to say with him. His story was over. But even though Rick got killed, this was a huge story, and there needed to be a bit of an epilogue to tie a bow on things. Issue 192 begins with Carl checking on his father in the morning, seeing that he's reanimated, and Carl doesn't hesitate to shoot his own father. It's become instinct. Sebastian is quickly caught, arrested, and everyone decides to continue to follow the law. Carl isn't happy about it, but agrees that Sebastian should be imprisoned instead of executed without any trial. But Carl was raised in a dark world, which included a romance with one of the Whisperers and time spent talking with an incarcerated Negan. Carl vows to Sebastian that he will continue to check on him every year and that he will enjoy the fact that Sebastian will never be free. Hey folks, this is Chris, and I've got one more thought that I thought of while editing this sequence. As I look at these pages, it occurs to me that artist Charlie Adlard never illustrates Sebastian behind bars, implying to me that's just sort of where he belongs. Instead, he always frames the shot of Carl through the bars, implying that Carl is sort of trapped with these emotions. I thought that was a very artistic approach. So at the time, Rick had been killed off, and readers were confused. What was going to happen next? Were we going to follow Carl now? I can remember in the early 2000s hanging out with Tony Moore, and he showed me a sketchbook of ideas for the future. This is when he and Robert were still drumming up the ideas for The Walking Dead. And one of those sketches included an adult Carl with an eye patch riding a motorcycle. Tony told me that this sketchbook with those ideas accidentally fell in a tub and got ruined. The image I'm showing here is an old man Carl sketch Tony did in 2019, and he explains how some of the earliest ideas included Carl taking over the book one day. But that's not what happened. Instead, Robert surprised everybody. Before the final issue, 193, hit newsstands, fans had no idea The Walking Dead was ending. Why would they? The issue sold over 110,000 copies, probably over 125,000 copies, because stores were able to do a snap reprint order. But even issue 192 had sold over 85,000 copies, enough to outsell top-performing books like Batman. Kirkman surprised everyone with Rick's death with two sneaky decisions. One was to sell the final issue at the normal price of $3.99, even though it was 3 times the size of a normal issue. And the second was to solicit the next 3 issues of The Walking Dead to comic book stores, with 3 fake covers. Issue 194 introduced a new character, Officer Kapoor. Issue 195 showed a shadowy figure impaled with a solicitation copy reading that the swordsman strikes. And issue 196 shows Carl's wife, Sophia, and his daughter, Andrea, over a grave. In fact, Robert has said that the general idea for the fake covers was to hint at Carl's eventual death. In an interview on Cartoonist Kayfabe, Robert explained he does regret tricking the fans and retailers, but felt it was necessary to surprise people.
The downside to that, though, is that the largest retailers are DCBS and Midtown Comics, and they do a ton of business through mail order. So your most valuable retail partners who order the most books had taken a ton of orders for issues that no longer exist, and they had to cancel those orders and refund those customers. So that part was possibly a miscalculation on my part. The surprise of it all, I guess, was worth it in the end. But I did have some retailers that were somewhat angry with me when it happened.
Personally, I don't think Robert Kirkman should feel any regret. I think that surprise made a lasting impact that justifies what was done. And he has done plenty to help comic book stores over the years. One related story like that was when comic shops were hurting during the pandemic, so Robert created a Negan one-shot and in a press release explained that it would be given to stores completely free to help them recover. The Walking Dead is a horror book, and it can be hard to scare or surprise a reader. You can disturb them, you can make them feel tragedy. A surprise is very hard, and Rick Grimes' death, in my opinion, came at the right time, and the fact that it's a surprise helps give the book a memorable ending. In the final issue, there's a time jump forward to Carl as an adult. The story begins with Carl killing a zombie, which are now rarely seen. In fact, it's revealed that Carl's brother-in-law, Herschel, has been taking caged zombies town to town in a carnival show, and one got loose. It leads to a court case where Herschel argues the zombie was his property, but ultimately the judge, Michonne, determines this practice will be outlawed. We see that towns are safe, travel between them is normal, and there's been a statue of Rick erected to remember him by. Rick was never a perfect person. He executed Dexter in cold blood when he felt he was a danger. Rick made a snap decision to kill Dwight to save Governor Pamela Milton. And he underestimated opponents like the Governor and Negan, which cost him his wife and newborn daughter, friends like Glenn and Abraham, to say nothing of his own right hand. But if his legacy is that of a martyr, and he can bring peace to the world, that's really not too different than most public figures that end up with statues, is it? And who among us would suspect issue 193 would be the final issue? Surely somebody would push it to at least a nice even 200, right? Well, no, again, a nice surprise that people just weren't expecting. It also makes sense on a logical scale, because if you went to 200, all of a sudden that means that the next trade paperback or omnibus are really, really gigantic or really, really small. It ended at the right time to be just about right for all of the omnibuses and trades to be the same size. And if Robert was deceptive about issue 193 being the final issue, he was also honest and upfront about the book being about Rick's life story. At the back of the issue, Robert wrote a 6-page letter to the audience explaining why the time was right to end things. He wrote about how in 2015 he saw the cover that series artist Charlie Adlard illustrated for issue 142, showing the town fair in Alexandria where the survivors were then living, and it dawned on him that the end was now in sight. He wrote, quote, "But when I saw the cover to 142, it dawned on me, oh shit, we're already at the fair. The Commonwealth is just around the corner, and, oh man, there's no way I'm going to make it to issue 300. And he continues later saying, quote, "I didn't know exactly how long we'd fight the Whisperers or how long we'd be spending in the Commonwealth before Rick would bring about his own demise, but I knew the whole run wouldn't be another 150 issues. And ultimately, The Walking Dead closes out with about the happiest ending you could hope for at this point. Carl is happily married and has a daughter. Rick is buried next to Andrea, his partner. Michonne is a judge and has a daughter and granddaughter. We hear that Jesus and Aaron are living happily. We see a panel of characters like Princess and Mercer together. Maggie is the new president. Eugene is completing a railway between the East and West Coasts to reunite civilization. And even though Herschel loses his case by getting this hard no, he probably avoids a fate like that of Sebastian. And even with Sebastian, we see that Pamela continues to visit her son as they get older. Do I have any criticisms about The Walking Dead? Sure. Sometimes I think, hey, this is a little bleak. I know Robert Kirkman can handle humorous dialogue with books like Battle Pope, Invincible, Brit. I know he can do that. Would it have been so hard to have, say, a playful little dog or a character kind of like Princess from the beginning? I think that a little bit of levity could have gone quite a long way in terms of balancing the story out here and there. I think sometimes the dialogue between characters can seem very functional instead of giving them personality. But at the same time, I think that Kirkman writes very believable characters. I think that they are complex. Rick, for instance, is flawed. He makes mistakes, but he also is a hero. He overcomes his shortcomings. And I think that the characters have strong motivations that make sense. So ultimately, I like the character arcs and I like the plots. And that goes a long way to enjoying the story. I believe that The Walking Dead ended its run at the perfect point and gives us hope for the future. And that is a stark contrast to one of the original ideas Robert had for ending the book. Somewhere around issue 70, he originally had considered ending the story in a similar way back in the town of Alexandria by about issue 100. He says that you would have seen Rick die, you would have seen a statue of Rick, and then the camera would slowly pull out and you'd realize that the world was now overrun by zombies, that they eventually, ultimately, did take over society. That is a pretty bleak ending. I think that it is much more satisfying the way it did end because we read a 16-year-long story. We were with these characters side by side, and they were fighting with every ounce of their being for a more hopeful future. And this gives it to them. So I think that this is a poignant ending. I think that Robert Kirkman, Tony Moore, Charlie Adlard, the various inkers, letterers, and editors really did give us a beautiful ending to a wonderful book. And I appreciate that Robert Kirkman fooled us all. Thanks so much for watching this episode. I have a few thoughts that I'll give you over the closing credits, but until then, this was this episode. Thank you very much for watching. Please hit things like and subscribe. That really helps the channel. I could use the help. You can give it to me. It's not too much of an ask, I don't think. I'll see you very soon. I've got tons of ideas for the future. I can't wait for 2025 on Comic Tropes. Until I see you next time, keep reading comics. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching this episode. Man, The Walking Dead was a really impressive accomplishment. There's so many reasons why it shouldn't have worked. You know, superheroes were certainly the most dominant genre at the time that this came out. Horror has had a huge resurgence. I think some of that is thanks to The Walking Dead. I'm talking about in comics specifically. It's black and white. And yet it was outselling books like Batman and Spider-Man. I think that just shows how engrossing it is and how much these characters were kind of enjoyable to hang out with. It was a long run. I think that was a very long run, but I loved it. I really did. That's the second printing actually also. I used to get sent all the comics because I would proofread Walking Dead from the beginning. But I did wonder if something was up because I didn't get the last couple of issues to proofread. I was like, what's going on here? And they didn't send me the originals. So I was like, wait, what's going on? So it was a surprise for me too. And I liked it. I liked being surprised. Anyway, that was a lot of fun. I think it's a great comic. I do recommend it. I recommend it because it's also super easy to read. You can either get 4 omnibuses or 32 trade paperbacks. Pick up the original issues. I could go on forever. Love The Walking Dead. Curious to hear your thoughts. Did you find the ending satisfying? Did you watch the show to the end? Do you have any preferences between the TV show and the comic? Thanks. I'll be looking at your comments below. See you next time.